In the heart of Madrid, beneath ceilings painted with angels and gold, a king was dying, slowly, publicly, and from the inside out. His name was Charles II of Spain, but history would remember him by another title, the Bewitched. For 38 years, he ruled one of the richest empires on earth. Yet his body was a collapsing empire of its own. From the day he was born, whispers filled the royal halls. His limbs were frail, his cries barely a sound. Servants crossed themselves, believing the child was cursed. But the curse wasn't from witches or spells. It was written deep within his blood. Generations of royal marriages, looping between cousins, uncles, and nieces, had created a perfect genetic storm. The proud Habsburg dynasty, obsessed with keeping its pure bloodline, had unknowingly signed its own death warrant. By the time Charles inherited the throne, his empire stretched from the Americas to Asia, but he could barely stand. His jaw jutted forward so far that eating was torture. His speech was a slur of sounds few could understand. Courtiers avoided his chambers not out of disrespect, but because the air itself reeked of decay. Yet for decades, Spain insisted he was divine, chosen by God. And in a sense, he was chosen to be the living proof of how power and pride can destroy the very thing they seek to preserve. This is not a story of a villain or a monster. It's the true story of a man born to rule the world, but doomed by his own blood. In the 17th century, Spain was still draped in gold. Its empire stretched farther than any other in history, across the Atlantic to the Americas, across the Pacific to the Philippines. Silver galleons crossed the seas like floating fortresses, carrying wealth home to Madrid. The capital itself glittered with marble palaces, jeweled altars, and portraits of kings painted by masters like Velázquez. But beneath this surface of splendor, something was already dying. The rot didn't begin in the streets, or in the markets, or even in the throne room. It began in the blood, generation after generation of it. The House of Habsburg had ruled for nearly 2 centuries. They saw themselves as chosen by God, the purest of Europe's royal bloodlines. But their definition of purity was the beginning of their downfall. The Habsburgs believed that power was safest when it stayed in the family. So they married their cousins, their nieces, sometimes their uncles. It was politics and superstition blended into one. By keeping the blood royal, they believed they were keeping the empire eternal. But nature does not bend for titles. Over time, their family tree stopped branching. It began curling in on itself. Names repeated across generations. The same faces appeared in portraits again and again, their jaws jutting forward, their chins melting into their necks. It wasn't just resemblance, it was degeneration. Every marriage tightened the genetic noose a little more. By the middle of the 1600s, the Habsburgs of Spain had become a dynasty living on borrowed time. When King Philip IV looked upon his infant son in 1661, he saw both a miracle and a warning. The child was named Charles, and he was his father's last hope for a male heir. Philip's other children had died, some in infancy, others deformed or sickly. Now the survival of the empire rested in the hands of this fragile newborn. But even as the church bells rang to announce his birth, the whispers began. The baby's cry was faint, barely audible. His limbs were thin and trembled when touched. His skin had the color of wax, and his head seemed too large for his body. Queen Mariana of Austria, his mother, and also his father's niece, wept when she saw him. She knew the pattern too well. The royal physicians spoke in hushed Latin phrases that avoided the truth. The prince was not right. They baptized him within hours, as if afraid he might not live through the night. As Charles grew, it became clear that he would never be like other children. He did not walk until he was 8. His speech was slurred, his comprehension poor. The tutors hired to educate him despaired. The boy could barely focus, and his tongue was too large for his mouth. He drooled constantly, unable to control the muscles of his jaw. But what the courtiers feared most wasn't his frailty, it was what his face represented. The Habsburg jaw, that famous protrusion seen in every family portrait, had reached its extreme in Charles. His mouth could barely close. His lower lip jutted forward, his teeth overlapped grotesquely, and his chin melted into his neck. Eating was painful. Speaking was worse. Pain became the constant rhythm of his life, disguised beneath velvet and gold. Still, the court called him El Hechizado, the Bewitched. For them, his condition was the work of dark magic, perhaps a curse from France or from God himself. But history would later uncover a far more tragic truth. In 2009, Geneticists would study the Habsburg family tree and calculate Charles's coefficient of inbreeding, the measure of how closely related someone's parents were. For Charles, it was 0.254, higher than if his parents had been full siblings. His 32 great-great-great-grandparents should have been 32 different people. In reality, there were only 10 unique individuals. Centuries before DNA was discovered, the Habsburgs had unknowingly created a genetic trap, a kind of silent curse encoded within their own lineage. Every child born after them would carry the same mutations, the same recessive genes that, when combined, turned royal pride into physical agony. Charles was not just a king. He was the final, living experiment of that legacy. The Spain he was born into mirrored his condition. On the surface, it still commanded vast territories, but inside, it was hollow. Wars with France drained its treasury. Corruption eroded the bureaucracy. The Catholic Church demanded more gold, while peasants starved in the fields that funded it. And now, the empire had a child on the throne who could barely stand. When Philip IV died in 1665, Charles was only 4. His mother, Queen Mariana, became regent, ruling in his name. The court tried to hide the extent of the boy's weakness. He was paraded on rare occasions, dressed in silk and jewels, carried by servants because he could not walk far. Every public appearance was carefully staged, a miracle of monarchy masking a biological tragedy. Behind closed doors, the truth was impossible to ignore. The young king suffered seizures so violent that servants had to hold him down. Physicians bled him regularly, believing it would balance his humors. They applied leeches, burned his skin with heated glass cups, and made him drink mixtures of herbs, minerals, and ground animal parts. None of it worked. If anything, it worsened his already fragile state. And yet, the court refused to see him as a patient. To them, Charles was still a symbol of divine authority, the living embodiment of Spain's chosen destiny. The irony was devastating. A king worshipped as God's anointed was, in truth, a victim of his ancestors' arrogance, a body collapsing under the weight of its own purity. Outside the palace, Spain's enemies watched with growing interest. Louis XIV of France, the Sun King, was building his own empire to the north, waiting for the day the Spanish crown would fall into his orbit. Meanwhile, within Spain, the nobility whispered about succession. Who would rule when this frail monarch inevitably died without an heir? But for now, the boy lived. And so the empire waited, like a great ship, gilded and glorious, but with its timbers already rotting beneath the paint. In every portrait painted during his youth, Charles II stares out with a kind of haunted innocence. His skin pale, his eyes large and tired, his lips parted as if mid-breath. The painters tried to flatter him, but even their skill couldn't disguise the truth. The face that once symbolized divine right now symbolized decay. Each brushstroke was a record of decline. By the time he reached adolescence, Charles's condition had only worsened. His body remained thin and weak, his legs trembled, his balance unsteady. He could barely chew food and had to be fed soft pastes and broths. His tutors abandoned any attempt to teach him Latin or philosophy. The boy who should have ruled the world could barely rule himself. And yet, through it all, the crown remained upon his head. The empire endured, at least in name. The ship still sailed, the priest still preached, the nobles still bowed. But the foundations of Spain, like the bones of its king, were slowly turning to dust. In Charles II, history would find its most tragic irony, a monarch born to embody divine perfection, whose very existence revealed the price of human vanity. He was not cursed by sorcery. He was cursed by heritage. And as the light of the Spanish Golden Age dimmed, the boy king sat in his palace surrounded by gold, while his body, like his empire, quietly began to rot. The bells of Madrid rang the day Prince Charles of Spain was born, but even then, few dared to say the words aloud. The kingdom's last hope had come too weak to hold its weight. The child was pale, trembling, and nearly silent when he cried. Servants whispered prayers in the corners of the room, as though his fragility might anger God. His father, King Philip IV, was aging and exhausted. His body carried the scars of too many wars and too many failed heirs. The Queen, Mariana of Austria, wept quietly as she looked at her son, both his mother and his cousin, bound to him not only by blood but by the burden of centuries of inbreeding. The physicians baptized the newborn within hours. In 17th century Spain, that was a sign not of celebration, but of fear. They feared he might not live through the night. In the months that followed, the signs grew clearer. His limbs were too thin to support him. His eyes wandered without focus. He struggled to swallow milk and often choked. The royal doctors recommended warm wine, goat's blood, and crushed pearls mixed with sugar, a miracle remedy for divine weakness. None of it worked. When he reached 2, the court realized that the prince could not crawl, let alone stand. He lay in embroidered blankets while other children of nobles learned to ride ponies and swing wooden swords. To keep rumors from spreading, Queen Mariana ordered that her son's condition remain secret. Public appearances were limited to brief ceremonies where he was carried like a porcelain doll, silent and motionless, while courtiers bowed and shouted "Viva el Principe." The illusion of strength was easier to maintain than the truth. By the time Charles turned 5, Spain itself had begun to mirror his condition. Once the mightiest empire on earth, its armies were losing ground to France. Silver shipments from the Americas had slowed. Famine and plague haunted the countryside. The empire was bloated with gold, yet starving at its core, just like the child who would one day rule it. His father's death in 1665 sealed the tragedy. The boy king was 4 years old when the crown was placed on his head. He could barely hold it upright. The regency passed to Queen Mariana, who ruled in his name. The court functioned like a vast machine of denial. Ministers spoke of divine providence, painting the young king as a symbol of purity and endurance. But behind the closed doors of the palace, every day began and ended in quiet panic. Charles's seizures grew more violent. Servants found him on the floor convulsing, his lips blue, foam at the corners of his mouth. Doctors bled him to balance the humours, applying leeches and hot cups to draw out imagined poisons. Each attempt left him weaker. They wrote long reports filled with Latin words that disguised their helplessness. No one wanted to admit the obvious truth: the boy was breaking down from the inside. At 8, he finally learned to walk, shakily, with the help of 2 attendants holding his arms. His steps were uncertain, his head lolling forward, his spine curved. He drooled constantly. The enlarged tongue that filled his mouth made it nearly impossible to pronounce words clearly. When foreign ambassadors visited, the court staged elaborate displays. Trumpets announced the young king's entrance, musicians played fanfares, and the boy was carried to his throne. Once seated, he smiled faintly, his jaw trembling. The guests bowed deeply, pretending not to see the child's vacant stare. Spain needed the illusion more than ever. His education was another ordeal. Tutors came and went, frustrated by the boy's limited comprehension. Latin lessons ended in tears. Arithmetic made no sense to him. He memorized prayers, but often confused the words. At court banquets, he sat quietly, picking at soft bread soaked in broth, unable to chew solid food. When he was 10, an Italian ambassador wrote in secret dispatches, "His Majesty does not speak nor understand as a child of his age should. His body is weak, his legs thin, his mouth constantly open. He is more a shadow of a prince than a boy." Still, the monarchy endured on ritual and denial. The regent queen commissioned new portraits to present her son as robust and noble. Painters were instructed to soften his features, to disguise the infamous Habsburg jaw that jutted forward grotesquely. Yet even their finest brushes could not hide what nature had written. The young king's face was pale, stretched, and weary. His lips hung open. His eyes seemed to gaze past the painter into nothingness. Those portraits now hang in museums, documents of denial disguised as art. When Charles reached adolescence, superstition took the place of science. The court's physicians had failed. Now the priests took over. Exorcisms were whispered about in secret. Holy relics were brought into the palace, candles burned through the night, and monks prayed over his bed. The boy lay there, half conscious, while the scent of incense mixed with the stench of sickness. Spain, in the meantime, was falling apart. Provinces rebelled, trade dwindled, and France pushed harder across its borders. The empire that once claimed half the world could barely feed itself. Still, the nobles assured one another that everything would be fine, because the king lived. As long as Charles breathed, Spain could pretend it was eternal. But inside his frail body, the truth was unrelenting. His bones were brittle, his joints inflamed, his immune system failing. Every small illness struck like a hammer. A mild fever could leave him bedridden for weeks. And through it all, his mind drifted between lucidity and confusion. Sometimes he spoke clearly about hunting or horses. Other times he saw visions, shadows moving at the edges of his room, voices calling from nowhere. The doctors blamed demons. The priests blamed witches. The truth, though invisible to them, was biological. Modern science would later uncover the explanation: a catastrophic inbreeding coefficient, the highest ever recorded in a royal family. The genetic pool had narrowed so much that harmful recessive genes found one another generation after generation, until the final heir, Charles II, carried the weight of them all. He suffered from multiple genetic disorders: pituitary hormone deficiency, severe mandibular prognathism, probable renal acidosis, and infertility. But these were terms that would not exist for another 300 years. In his lifetime, they were interpreted as curses, omens, or divine punishment. The irony was cruel. The dynasty that claimed its blood was sacred had made that very blood poisonous. As Charles reached his teenage years, the palace adapted around his limitations. His meals were prepared in paste form, his clothes tailored loose to hide the skeletal frame. Servants learned to move silently so as not to startle him. His favorite pastime was watching birds in gilded cages, creatures trapped in beauty, much like himself. Visitors recorded the contradictions: a court drowning in luxury, ruled by a boy too weak to stand for more than a few minutes. Outside, the streets of Madrid echoed with poverty and resentment. The people prayed for a miracle, but miracles require strength, and strength was something their king would never have. Still, Charles survived. Year after year, his fragile heart kept beating, as if sheer will or divine irony refused to let the line end just yet. The courtiers whispered that each birthday was proof of God's favor. But in private, even the priests knew the truth. This survival was not a blessing, it was an extended sentence. The boy who had been born pale and silent was now the center of an empire collapsing under the same weight he carried in his veins. His body had become a reflection of Spain itself, beautiful on the outside, broken within. He was no longer just a prince or a king. He was a living prophecy of decline. And though the world around him still glittered with golden hymns, the echo of his suffering would soon resound far beyond the palace walls, warning the future of what happens when power becomes blind to nature itself. By the time Charles II turned 12, Madrid had grown used to pretending. Every morning, the bells of the royal palace rang with ceremony, priests recited prayers for the king's health, and courtiers bowed deeply as he was carried through the marble corridors in a velvet chair. From a distance, it all looked like the continuation of a glorious empire. But up close, the illusion cracked. The boy they called El Hechizado, the Bewitched, was now a young monarch in name only. His thin arms trembled when he tried to lift a goblet. His speech was slow, words slipping out of the side of his mouth in a mixture of slurs and sighs. He could not chew solid food. His eyes, dull and sunken, seemed to stare past the people around him as if searching for something that wasn't there. To the outside world, Spain was still vast. Its territories stretched across the oceans, but inside the palace, power had collapsed into whispers. The ministers ruled through his mother, Queen Mariana, while the child king watched from his throne like a fragile figurine surrounded by gold. The throne of Spain had become a hollow stage, and its actor could barely move. When ambassadors visited from other nations, the court orchestrated every movement like theater. The king would be dressed in shimmering silk, his hair powdered and combed, his crown carefully positioned to hide the tremor in his head. The trumpets would sound, courtiers lined up in rows, and the boy would be carried into the hall. For a few moments, the illusion of majesty flickered to life. But once the guests were gone, the mask fell. The servants rushed to wipe the drool from his chin, to ease the heavy crown from his aching neck, to massage his swollen joints. The empire of gold was being ruled by a child who could barely lift his own head. Behind the tapestries and rituals, Spain's decline had already begun. Queen Mariana, still acting as regent, faced impossible choices. She was a devout Catholic, certain that her son's suffering was a divine test rather than a curse of blood. She filled the palace with priests and confessors, begging for miracles. Holy water was sprinkled across his bed. Relics were pressed to his chest. The court physicians, meanwhile, continued their rituals of bleeding, cupping, and herbal potions, each one promising balance to the four humors that governed life. None of it helped. By his teenage years, Charles's body had grown, but his strength had not. His legs were bowed, his posture stooped. His skin had taken on a greyish tint. He tired easily, slept often, and rarely left his chambers. The corridors of the royal palace grew quieter, and the smell of incense and medicine clung to the air. At night, the servants whispered that the young king's room was haunted. They said they saw shadows moving near his bed, that they heard him muttering to unseen visitors. In truth, Charles's mind was beginning to fail under the weight of pain, exhaustion, and superstition. His hallucinations were interpreted not as illness, but as evidence of witchcraft. In 1679, when he was 18, Europe watched in fascination as Spain announced a royal marriage. The empire needed an heir, and France offered a princess, Marie-Louise of Orleans, niece of King Louis XIV. The match was meant to restore power and produce a child who would unite two dynasties. But when the princess arrived in Madrid, she found not the prince of her dreams, but a frail, trembling man who looked twice his age. His lips were pale, his breath laboured, his face twisted by the Habsburg jaw that had haunted generations. Marie-Louise was horrified. She wrote to her family in France, "I see death everywhere in this court. My husband cannot stand for long, nor speak clearly. He looks at me as though I were a stranger, and I fear he will not live long enough to know me." The marriage became an ordeal of public humiliation. The doctors prescribed strange remedies to restore the king's vigor, powders made of crushed bull's horns, aphrodisiac tonics, even the blood of freshly killed animals. Priests performed blessings over the royal bedchamber. Nothing worked. The union was never consummated. The queen spent her days in loneliness, wandering the palace gardens while her husband remained confined to his chambers. The people whispered that she was cursed, that France had sent her to finish destroying Spain. But in truth, the curse had already been written long before she arrived. Outside the palace, the empire crumbled piece by piece. Spain's armies lost battles to France. Portugal had broken away. The Netherlands were gone. The silver from the Americas could no longer keep pace with the debts of endless wars. What had once been the richest kingdom on earth was now bankrupt, bleeding from the inside just as its king was. And still, the court insisted on ceremony. Charles II was paraded through Madrid on holy days, carried on a throne of gold as the crowd knelt in awe. They didn't see the truth hidden behind the velvet curtains, the trembling hands, the spasms, the shallow breathing. To his people, he was still the chosen one, the divine monarch destined to restore Spain's greatness. To those who served him, he was a prisoner inside his own body. In private moments, the young king tried to grasp his duties. He signed decrees that others wrote for him, his hand guided by a secretary. He asked questions he couldn't remember an hour later. His ministers argued over policy and alliances while he sat silently, nodding at random, unsure what was being discussed. When he looked into the mirror, he hardly recognized himself. The skin around his eyes had sunken, his teeth were decaying, and his jaw protruded so far he could barely close his mouth. The reflection that stared back wasn't a king, it was a relic. The tragedy of Charles II wasn't that he failed his country. It was that he was never given a chance to succeed. He had inherited a world already collapsing, and a body too weak to hold it together. In 1689, after 10 years of marriage, Queen Marie-Louise died suddenly. Officially, the cause was appendicitis. But rumors spread that she had been poisoned, perhaps by Spanish nobles who blamed her for the king's infertility, or by the French, who sought to control succession through another bride. Charles was devastated. He shut himself in his room for days, refusing food, praying aloud for her soul. Some say he tried to summon her spirit through seances arranged by court mystics. Others believed he was losing his mind. Both may have been true. The death of his wife left him completely alone, an empress surrounded by ghosts. By the early 1690s, Spain had become a shadow of its former self. The treasury was empty. Rebellions simmered in the colonies. The King's Council was divided between those who wanted to align with France and those who wanted to side with Austria. And at the center of it all sat Charles, gaunt and grey, his crown resting awkwardly on his thinning hair. Every breath he took was a negotiation between life and death. His heart was weak, his kidneys failing, his speech reduced to a whisper. Yet every morning, he was dressed, perfumed, and carried into the council chamber to perform the role expected of him. The courtiers bowed, pretending not to notice the smell of sickness in the air. The empire had become a mausoleum of rituals, a theatre of power without substance. In the end, Charles's rule was not one of conquest or glory, but of endurance. He was the last spark of a lineage that had tried to live forever by marrying itself, and in doing so, ensured its own extinction. Spain's decline mirrored his own body, once magnificent, now hollow, rotting slowly while the world moved on. The throne still gleamed under candlelight, but beneath it, there was nothing left but bone and shadow. Charles II was not a monster. He was a man born into a dynasty that mistook pride for destiny, a king who ruled an empire that had already begun to crumble long before he took the crown. And as the century closed, the hollow throne of Spain stood as the most haunting monument of all, a monument not to victory, but to the fatal illusion of purity. By the time the 1690s began, the royal palace of Madrid had turned into something closer to a monastery than a seat of government. Incense smoke hung in the halls, candles burned day and night before holy relics and icons. Servants moved in whispers, and somewhere behind the heavy velvet curtains, a dying king clung to what little remained of his strength. Charles II of Spain was 30 years old but looked twice that. His hair had thinned into fragile tufts, his eyes were dull, and his skin had taken on the pale translucence of parchment. He rarely left his chambers anymore. His meals were prepared as pastes and broths. Solid food could no longer pass his throat. When he slept, he wheezed and coughed. When he woke, he prayed. Doctors, priests, and alchemists filled his rooms in a constant rotation of hope and desperation. They brought their instruments, their powders, their crosses, each convinced they could fix what generations had broken. The empire's greatest minds were now united by one goal: to save a king who was beyond saving. Every morning began the same way. At sunrise, Charles was lifted from his bed by two servants and placed into a cushioned chair beside the window. He would gaze silently at the courtyard gardens, where birds sang in gilded cages. Then came the procession, physicians entering one by one, offering advice wrapped in ritual. His Majesty must be bled, one would insist. The humours are imbalanced. Another countered, no, he is cursed. His soul must be cleansed by prayer and fasting. A third suggested the latest European miracle: powdered rhinoceros horn mixed with amber and wine. None of them dared to say the truth aloud, that his illness was not of the body alone, but of the bloodline. The Habsburgs' obsession with purity had created a medical impossibility. Charles was not merely sick, he was genetically collapsing. As Spain's royal doctors fought among themselves, rumours began to fill the city. Commoners whispered that the king had been hexed by witches working for France. Others claimed he was possessed by demons, the punishment for his ancestors' sins. The church seized on the idea. A tribunal of priests declared that spiritual corruption had entered the royal household. They demanded exorcisms. And so, on a cold winter night in 1698, the ceremony began. In a darkened chapel deep within the palace, thick candles flickered against the stone walls. The smell of incense mixed with sweat and fear. Charles sat in his chair, eyes half closed, lips trembling as priests circled him chanting Latin prayers. They sprinkled holy water on his head, pressed crucifixes to his forehead, and commanded the devil to leave his body. Witnesses described the scene as terrifying. The king shuddered violently, his head jerking forward, his mouth moving but no words coming out. Some said he screamed, others swore he laughed. When it was over, the lead priest claimed success. The evil had been expelled. But the next morning, Charles awoke weaker than ever. His hand shook so badly he could no longer hold a pen. The exorcists returned, blaming not themselves but the persistence of sin. They promised that more rituals would purify him completely. This cycle repeated again and again, faith attempting to cure what science could not yet name. Outside the palace, the empire suffered its own sickness. Spain's economy was in free fall. Ships from the Americas arrived half empty. Armies were unpaid, rebellion simmered, and foreign diplomats circled Madrid like vultures. Everyone knew that when the king died, a war over his throne would begin. But inside his chambers, Charles still clung to life, fragile, frightened, and alone. His second wife, Maria Anna of Neuburg, a German princess, became his caretaker more than his queen. She read to him from the Bible, prayed beside his bed, and tried to manage the court factions that tore at one another behind closed doors. Some nobles accused her of poisoning him, others accused her of witchcraft. She slept lightly, always aware that her husband might die in the next room at any moment. Each morning she faced the same question from the council: would His Majesty be strong enough to appear today? Usually, the answer was no. The king's body had begun to betray him in new and horrifying ways. His legs and feet swelled grotesquely. Sores opened on his arms that refused to heal. His breath carried the sour scent of infection. Servants fainted while changing his bedsheets. And still, the courtiers spoke of divine destiny, of how the king's suffering was proof that God had chosen him. By 1699, the situation had become unbearable. The empire was paralyzed. Foreign ambassadors wrote home describing a monarch half alive, half corpse. One French observer compared the Spanish court to a tomb lit by gold. Yet, even as the king's body decayed, the rituals never stopped. His doctors ordered another round of treatments: mercury ointments, purgative herbs, even injections of powdered bone marrow. None of it worked. The swelling grew worse. His voice shrank to a whisper. In his final months, Charles became obsessed with death. He asked priests to read him stories of the martyrs and the saints. He begged God to forgive the sins of his ancestors. Some nights, he would wake screaming that demons were sitting at the foot of his bed. The priests told him those demons were real, proof that the devil still wanted his soul. And so the exorcisms began again. The last of these rituals was performed in the autumn of 1700. The chapel glowed with candlelight as a frail, skeletal Charles knelt before the altar, trembling, his crown set aside. The priest sprinkled holy water and recited verses from the book of Job. When the ceremony ended, the king looked up and whispered, "If God wills it, I shall die clean." He returned to his bed, exhausted. That night, his attendants noticed that the color had drained completely from his face. His breath was shallow, his pulse faint. The doctors prepared yet another tonic. The priests prepared for another prayer. But it was clear to everyone present that the end was near. Modern historians would later reconstruct what those final weeks were like through the journals of his attendants. They describe a man decomposing while still alive, his skin waxy and cold, his eyes glazed, his speech incoherent. His mind drifted between moments of clarity and madness. Some nights he ordered his crown brought to him and placed on his chest so that it might rise with me before God. When he could no longer speak, he asked for parchment and dictated his last decree, the choice of a successor. He named Philip of Anjou, a French prince, as his heir, a decision that would ignite the War of Spanish Succession, a conflict that would tear Europe apart for more than a decade. It was his final act of agency, the last decision of a king who had spent his entire life controlled by others, his mother, his doctors, his priests, his blood. At dawn on November 1st, 1700, the bells of Madrid tolled once more. Charles II of Spain was dead. The autopsy report was horrifying. His heart was the size of a peppercorn, his intestines rotted, his lungs corroded. His brain, the doctors wrote, was dissolved into water. He was only 38 years old. That morning, a Spanish courtier wrote in his diary, "The king is gone, and with him, the line of Habsburg Spain. May God have mercy on his soul, and on ours." But Charles's death was more than the end of a dynasty. It was the end of an illusion, the belief that divine right could rewrite the laws of nature, that bloodlines could be perfected through repetition, that purity was strength. His suffering exposed the truth that no crown, no ritual, no prayer could defy biology. The empire that once ruled half the world had fallen not to its enemies, but to its own vanity. In the silence after the bells stopped ringing, Spain began to face what it had long denied, that its greatest enemy had always been itself. The day after the bells of Madrid tolled for the death of King Charles II, the empire awoke to a silence it hadn't heard in centuries. For almost 200 years, the name Habsburg had meant power, wealth, and divine authority. But now, that name was written only on a tomb. The royal heralds marched through the capital, their black banners fluttering in the cold wind, proclaiming the end of the reign. The city wept, or pretended to. In the churches, priests chanted for the soul of the king, though some whispered that God had taken him not in mercy, but in judgment. And within the marble vaults of El Escorial, the pantheon of Spanish kings, a final space had been prepared. There, between the stone coffins of Philip II and Philip IV, the last Habsburg of Spain was laid to rest. He had been born a prince, crowned a king, and buried as a warning. When the doctors finished their autopsy, they recorded details so ghastly that even hardened courtiers refused to read them aloud. His heart was the size of a peppercorn. His lungs were corroded. His brain had dissolved into liquid. His intestines were blackened, his body already decomposing though he had been dead for only hours. In life, his blood had carried the weight of a dynasty. In death, it told the story of its ruin. The Habsburg curse, once dismissed as rumor, was now undeniable. Scientists centuries later would trace the family tree and prove what the courtiers could only sense, that generations of incestuous marriages had turned royal pride into genetic catastrophe. The irony was complete. An empire obsessed with keeping its blood pure had poisoned it beyond repair. Outside the palace, Spain began to unravel. The king had left no heir, and his final act, naming Philip of Anjou, a grandson of France's Louis XIV, as his successor, threw Europe into chaos. The French claimed the throne by will, the Austrians by blood. In 1701, the War of the Spanish Succession erupted, a conflict that would engulf the continent for over a decade. While soldiers marched and cannons roared across Europe, Spain itself was too exhausted to fight for meaning. The once great fleets were reduced to rust. The mines in the New World yielded little silver. The empire that had stretched across the oceans was now a fractured collection of territories, ruled in name but not in strength. The Habsburg dream of eternal dominion had died with Charles, but it refused to lie quietly in its grave. In Madrid, his death became legend. The people said that the night he died, the sky turned a sickly grey and the palace candles flickered out one by one. Some claimed to have seen his ghost wandering the corridors of El Escorial, clutching a crucifix, mumbling prayers for forgiveness. The priests, eager to preserve the image of divine order, declared him a martyr of faith. They painted his suffering as holy, a test sent by God to remind mortals of their imperfection. But among the scholars and physicians who dared speak the truth, the story was different. Charles II was not a symbol of holiness. He was a case study in human arrogance, a man destroyed by his ancestors' defiance of nature. The age of divine right was beginning to fade, and in its place came something more unsettling, the realization that kings were not chosen by God, but born from the same flawed flesh as everyone else. In the centuries that followed, Charles's portraits would hang in museums, studied not for their beauty but for what they revealed. Painters of his time had tried to flatter him, softening his deformities, smoothing his jawline, brightening his eyes. Yet even under layers of paint, the truth still leaked through. The heavy jaw, the vacant stare, the air of exhaustion that no artist could erase. Visitors today stand before those portraits in uneasy silence. The gold frames gleam, but the man inside them looks as if he's already fading. It's not the image of a ruler, but of a man slowly erased by his own lineage. Historians now call him the most inbred monarch in European history. His coefficient of inbreeding, 0.254, was higher than that of a child born to full siblings. That number alone tells the story of how a dynasty devoured itself, generation after generation, convinced that keeping power within the bloodline would preserve it forever. In truth, the Habsburgs had built their empire like a fortress made of glass, beautiful, reflective, but doomed to shatter under its own perfection. Each royal marriage, meant to strengthen the dynasty, had chipped away at its foundation. By the time Charles was born, the walls had already cracked. He was not the beginning of Spain's decline, he was the final symptom of it. After his death, Europe redrew its borders. The Bourbons of France inherited the Spanish crown, and the old Habsburg glory became a memory locked in marble tombs. The empire that had once claimed to bring God's light to the world was now a shadow of its former self. Its faith turned to ritual, its gold turned to debt, its power turned to silence. And yet, Charles II's story refused to disappear. To scientists, he became a textbook example of inbreeding depression, proof that genetic diversity was not weakness but survival. To historians, he became a symbol of the limits of monarchy. To moralists, a lesson in hubris. But beyond all of that, he remains, above all, a human tragedy. Imagine, for a moment, the boy who never asked to be king. A child born into a palace that smelled of incense and medicine. A life measured not in victories or years, but in endurance. He did not wage wars or sign treaties that changed history. His entire existence was a struggle simply to breathe, to eat, to speak. Every birthday was treated as a miracle. Every day survived as proof that divine power still favored Spain. But behind that miracle was a man suffocating beneath the weight of expectations and superstition. If his ancestors had been monsters of ambition, then Charles was their punishment, a man doomed to suffer for the pride of generations. Centuries later, the question his story raises still lingers. How far will humanity go to preserve power, even when it means destroying itself? The Habsburgs believed they could outsmart nature. Charles proved that no one can. His body was a battlefield where religion fought science, where politics fought biology, and in the end, all sides lost. When the bells tolled for him on that cold November morning, they did not just mourn a king. They marked the death of an era. The age of divine right had ended. The age of consequence had begun. Today, in the crypt of El Escorial, tourists walk past the stone tomb that bears his name.
Carlos II, Rey de España.
No titles of glory. No triumphs carved in marble. Just a name, a date, and silence. And perhaps that silence is the truest memorial of all, because for a man whose ancestors sought immortality, his greatest legacy was the proof that nothing, not even a royal bloodline, can live forever. Centuries have passed since Charles II of Spain took his final breath, yet his story refuses to fade. His tomb in El Escorial may be sealed in stone, but his legacy breathes through every whisper of history, every portrait that bears his face, every lesson his suffering left behind. The world remembers kings for their conquests, for the cities they built or the wars they won. Charles II left behind none of that. He ruled no victories, founded no monuments, and wrote no great laws. But what he did leave behind was something far more enduring, a warning carved into the very DNA of history, that power without wisdom and purity without balance can destroy everything it touches. When Charles died in 1700, the Spanish Empire was a body without a heartbeat. Within months, Europe erupted into the War of the Spanish Succession, a conflict not only over the throne, but over the idea of empire itself. The Habsburg dream of divine monarchy had fractured. No one could pretend anymore that royal blood was sacred or infallible. Charles's life had made that illusion impossible. His corpse had become the final argument against the myth of eternal dynastic strength. The war that followed reshaped Europe. The French Bourbons seized the Spanish crown, and for the first time in centuries, the throne passed to a family outside the Habsburg bloodline. New rulers came with new blood, and ironically, that fresh genetic mix ensured the survival of Spain itself. But the empire Charles had inherited was gone. Spain would never again dominate the world as it had under his ancestors. Its power drained away slowly, like candle wax melting after a long vigil. For centuries, the cause of Charles's suffering was wrapped in superstition. His own contemporaries spoke of curses, demons, and divine punishment. It wasn't until the 20th century that historians and geneticists uncovered the truth. In 2009, researchers from the University of Santiago de Compostela mapped out the Habsburg family tree and confirmed what the portraits had long suggested. The dynasty had been genetically cornered by inbreeding. The results were staggering. The study revealed that Charles II's coefficient of inbreeding, 0.254, was greater than that of a child born to full siblings. His 32 great-great-great-grandparents should have been 32 different people, yet only 10 unique individuals appeared repeatedly in the family tree. This wasn't a single mistake. It was a pattern, a deliberate policy pursued for generations in the name of power, faith, and purity. The Habsburgs had defied biology, and biology had exacted its revenge. The genetic consequences manifested brutally. Charles suffered from severe mandibular prognathism, the Habsburg jaw that deformed his mouth and face. He likely had pituitary hormone deficiency, which stunted his growth and caused infertility. Chronic immune disorders left him vulnerable to infection and fatigue. Neurological degeneration caused hallucinations and mental confusion in his final years. The king who could barely walk, eat, or speak had inherited not a curse, but a code, the inevitable result of a lineage folding in on itself. Charles's life stands today as one of the most profound case studies in how power distorts reason. His ancestors, convinced of their divine right, believed they could outwit nature by keeping the bloodline pure. What they created instead was a dynasty that collapsed inward, politically, morally, and physically. He was both a victim and a mirror. A victim of centuries of ambition. A mirror reflecting the truth of all empires, that no power, no crown, and no name can stand against the laws of life. In modern terms, Charles II might be called the world's first genetic warning. His life is now studied in universities, not for political theory, but for genetics, anthropology, and evolutionary biology. The story that once belonged to priests and painters now belongs to scientists and historians. Walk through the Prado Museum in Madrid today and you'll find Charles II gazing from the walls, his thin lips slightly parted, his eyes lost in shadow, the royal regalia gleaming around a body that looks too fragile to hold it. His portrait is more than a painting. It is a confession. No matter how much the artist softened his features, the truth still shone through. The brush could not disguise the exhaustion in his expression or the imbalance in his face. His body told the story his courtiers refused to speak. Standing before that canvas now, you can almost feel the silence of the court that surrounded him, the whisper of silk robes, the faint smell of incense and medicine, the hollow echo of footsteps in a palace that glittered on the surface but was rotting inside. If Charles's life marked the death of the old order, his legacy helped shape the modern one. After his passing, European monarchies quietly began to change their policies on marriage. The idea of pure blood gave way to strategic diversity. No one would admit it publicly, but behind the closed doors of royal courts, the lesson had been learned: too much purity breeds weakness. By the 18th century, genetic mixing among noble families became a matter of survival, not scandal. The tragedy of Charles II had rewritten the invisible rules of royal politics. His name became shorthand for the dangers of insularity, not just biological, but intellectual and political. Isolation, whether in blood or in ideas, leads to decay. It's easy to think of Charles II as a symbol, the last Habsburg, the bewitched king, the inbred monarch. But behind those titles was a human being. He laughed rarely, loved timidly, and lived in constant pain. Those who knew him closely describe him as gentle, childlike, and desperately lonely. He adored music but could not dance. He admired beauty but felt unworthy of it. Perhaps the cruelest truth of all is that Charles did nothing to deserve his fate. He was born into a destiny written centuries before his birth, the final chapter of decisions made by others who believed they were chosen by God. When he prayed each night for his soul and his country, he was not praying as a king, but as a man who wanted simply to be whole. Today, the story of Charles II endures not because of the crown he wore, but because of the questions he forces us to ask. How many of our own institutions, traditions, or obsessions mirror the same blindness that destroyed his family? How often do we mistake purity for perfection, or tradition for truth? Charles's body may have been the most fragile ever to sit upon a throne, but his story remains unbreakable. It transcends centuries, languages, and borders, a timeless reminder that every empire, every system, and every bloodline must adapt or die. His tomb at El Escorial is cold stone, silent and still. But his legacy lives wherever people try to understand how greatness collapses, not from enemies outside, but from blindness within. In the end, Charles II of Spain became something his ancestors could never have imagined. Not a ruler of worlds, but a teacher of humanity. He taught, without ever knowing it, that survival belongs not to the pure, but to the diverse. Not to the powerful, but to the humble. Not to those who claim divine right, but to those who respect the balance that sustains life itself. And that is how the broken crown of Spain became one of history's most enduring lessons. A symbol not of defeat, but of revelation. In the long echo that follows a dynasty's last breath, a different kind of history begins, the history of consequences. Charles II of Spain was buried with royal rights, placed among kings whose names had once reshaped maps. Yet the quiet that settled over El Escorial did not mean his story was finished. It travelled, across borders, across centuries, whispered in academies and argued in parliaments, sketched by painters and later modelled by scientists, until it hardened into something far stronger than marble, a lesson about the laws that outlive kings. These laws are not written on vellum under a royal seal. They do not march with armies or sway with public opinion. They live in cells, repair themselves at night, and fail in tragic, predictable ways when human pride narrows their possibilities. Charles's reign ended in 1700. The laws that judged it were older than the first crown that ever gleamed in candlelight. In his lifetime, people blamed witches and demons. Posthumously, they blamed the Habsburgs' marriages. But blame is not the same as understanding. True understanding arrived only when science learned a language older than Latin, a language of nucleotides and probabilities. Where theologians saw punishment and courtiers saw scandal, geneticists saw a shrinking combinatorial space. The family tree of Spain's kings had stopped branching and started looping, until the very idea of inheritance became a trap. That is the starkest truth Charles leaves behind. A crown can command armies, but it cannot command possibility. Possibility must be cultivated, by new blood, new ideas, new alliances. The Habsburgs confused purity with strength and paid the price encoded in every species survival manual. Variability is resilience. Closed circles are coffins with extra steps. We sometimes romanticize the past as a place of mystery, as though history is a drama lit by stained glass. Yet when we lift the glass, biology is there, plain, indifferent, exacting. Charles II did not fail to be a king. He was never given the variance to be one. It is comfortable to leave the Habsburg tragedy in museums, a cautionary panel beside an oil portrait. But history rarely sits still in frames. The pattern repeats where power and fear become partners. Institutions that marry their own ideas, communities that harden into echo chambers, teams that mistake pedigree for competence. In each case, the system grows elegant and brittle, confident and slow, until some shock reveals the truth. The architecture is ornate, the load-bearing beams are gone. Charles's court had processions, relics, and rules. We have slide decks, metrics, and memos. The rituals are different. The danger is the same, performance in place of adaptation. The Spanish court needed the appearance of a capable monarch more than it needed the painful admission that the monarchy itself had to change. Modern systems often want quarterly calm more than they want reform. Biology, markets, climates, none of them negotiate with ceremony. The lesson is not to despise ritual. Ritual can stabilize good habits. The lesson is to refuse ritual that protects a failing premise. Spain lit more candles. We add more dashboards. Neither fixes an error in the core design. Charles's lineage is often invoked to warn against the fantasy of pure blood. But another purity tempts the present: ideological purity. Institutions try to preserve a brand of thought as carefully as a dynasty preserved a surname. The result rhymes with the Habsburg's choice. The gene pool of ideas narrows, dissent is pathologized, and when reality demands heterodoxy, the system cannot metabolize it. Spain needed heterodoxy, a willingness to marry outside its circle, to learn from rivals, to accept that survival sometimes requires dilution of identity. We need heterodoxy too, in research, in governance, in culture. Diversity here is not decoration, it is infrastructure. The most compassionate reading of Charles is also the most demanding reading of ourselves. Open the windows before the air grows thin. To call Charles a case study is to risk a cruelty he did not deserve. He was a man in agony, not a graph. The ethical task of retelling his life is to transform suffering into protection for others without turning a person into a trope. That is why fair use in storytelling is more than a legal doctrine. It is a moral one. We quote the past to illuminate, not to exploit. We show enough to teach, not to thrill. There is a temptation, especially online, to turn every tragedy into spectacle. Charles's autopsy details have been repeated with morbid fascination for centuries. But the purpose of repeating them now is not to horrify. It is to anchor a principle in human scale. Choices made in private rooms with heraldry on the walls can cripple children who never asked for crowns. If we must summon the image of his thinning hair and labored breath, let it be to defend some living child from policies that inadvertently recreate closed circles, in medicine, in law, in opportunity. What if a single Habsburg generation had broken the circle? What if a marriage to a distant house had widened the tree? Historians can sketch such alternate timelines: a stronger heir, a softer descent, perhaps a smaller war. But the real counterfactual sits closer. What if institutions everywhere practiced prophylactic humility, admitting before crisis that their foundations need reinforcement? Spain's cost was counted in wars and treaties. Charles's cost was counted in days endured. He paid in hours of choking, hours of foggy fear, hours of being dressed in gold to impersonate strength. Policy failures often hide behind statistics. His agony refuses to be abstract. It insists that we convert what we know into what we do. If you walk today through Madrid's galleries, you might find yourself standing before a portrait of Charles II. The room is quiet. The air hums with the gentle machinery that preserves paint from humidity and light. You can almost hear another machine, the one that preserved him for 38 years despite everything. Lungs, heart, hormones, neurons, each failing, each compensating, each refusing until refusal was impossible. That portrait offers two reflections. In the varnish, you see yourself, the living viewer, breathing without effort, free to walk out into the sun. In the paint, you see the cost of a system that would not breathe. Museums are often archives of conquest. This canvas is an archive of warning. The great empires leave arches and coins. Charles leaves a lesson that fits in a single admonition: make room for air. Air in policy, dissent that can circulate without punishment. Air in science, replication, critique, and cross-pollination. Air in families, room for difference without exile. Air in culture, space for the new to be tested, not burned for being unfamiliar. Charles II's life closed one circle. The Habsburg loop in Spain ended with him. But the better circle is the open one we keep, the feedback loops that allow correction, the cycles of learning that widen rather than tighten. Monarchies learned, quietly, to marry out. Nations learned, unevenly, to diversify power. Science learned, relentlessly, to replace stories of curses with mechanisms that can be measured and mended. And yet, the temptation returns in every generation. Clamp down, define purity, wall off the strange. The antidote is not cynicism, it is stewardship. To inherit any institution, a lab, a law, a lineage, is to be entrusted with its porosity. Seal it, and you doom it. Perforate it thoughtfully, and you give it time. Charles never had that choice. We do. Epilogue. When the candles burned low on November 1st, 1700, a bell tolled for a man and a monarchy. What it could not toll for was the end of the law he had come to embody, that life survives by exchange. Exchange of genes, of ideas, of grace. The crown on his coffin was heavy because it had tried to bear a weight no artifact can, the fantasy that greatness can be preserved by narrowing what feeds it. The laws that outlive kings do not glitter. They are not escorted by guards. They are quiet, patient, and absolute. Charles II's greatness, if we can use that word, was to reveal them so clearly that even centuries later, they still instruct. Not as a curse, not as a spectacle, but as a compass. Pointing, always, away from the closed room. Toward the open door. When the last candle flickered out in the royal crypt of El Escorial, it seemed that Charles II's story had ended. Yet, like the echo of a bell long after the sound fades, his life continued to resonate, not through armies or decrees, but through reflection. For centuries, his name was whispered with pity, sometimes mockery, sometimes awe. El Hechizado, the bewitched. A man whose body rotted as he breathed, a king whose bloodline crumbled with his bones. But beneath that grotesque legend lies something deeper, a mirror held up to humanity's own illusions of control, purity, and permanence. The echo of Charles's life is not a sound of judgment. It is a hum, quiet, persistent, reminding us that all systems, even those gilded with faith and gold, are mortal. After Charles II's death in 1700, Spain entered a period of mourning that was more relief than grief. The courtiers who had once performed rituals around his frail body finally exhaled. The empire, exhausted by superstition and stagnation, had been freed, but also hollowed. The grand processions, the masses, the mourning banners, all were attempts to transform despair into ceremony. The priests proclaimed him a saintly sufferer, a king chosen by God to bear Spain's sins. But the people whispered another truth, that God had taken him because Spain refused to change. The silence that followed was heavy. For 2 centuries, the Habsburgs had ruled as though divine law bent to their will. Now, the marble tombs in El Escorial stood like frozen warnings, monuments to a lineage that mistook its blood for destiny. In the late 19th century, when science began to replace myth, scholars reopened the question of Charles II's condition. Historians dug through royal archives, faded letters from physicians, secret reports from foreign ambassadors, even fragments of the autopsy. The discoveries were shocking not because they revealed something new, but because they confirmed everything that superstition had tried to obscure. A royal physician's diary described a body swollen, leaking fluids, his skin cracked as if scorched by invisible fire. A French envoy wrote that His Majesty's eyes see not the world, but the suffering within himself. A priest recorded that the king's confessions often ended with the same question, "Why was I made this way?" None of them had an answer. But in the 20th century, genetics found one. The Habsburg dynasty's obsession with blood purity had collapsed into a statistical inevitability. The DNA that once symbolized divine right had become a coded record of human error. And so, centuries after his death, Charles II became one of the first kings to be studied not for his reign, but for his genome. Spain in the 17th century was the perfect reflection of its monarch, outwardly magnificent, inwardly decayed. Gold from the Americas gilded palaces and churches, but hunger and corruption ruled the streets. The empire's veins, like Charles's, were clogged. Every colony sent tribute to Madrid, yet little reached the people. Every war was fought in God's name, yet none were won. The king's suffering became a metaphor for his nation, a body swollen with ritual but drained of vitality. Modern historians see in Charles's reign the beginning of Spain's long descent, but also a critical transformation, the shift from divine politics to human accountability. When a king's broken body could no longer serve as proof of God's favor, Europe was forced to confront a new question. If kings are mortal, what makes power legitimate? The answer would take centuries to unfold, through revolutions, constitutions, and the slow rise of democracy. Yet its origin can be traced to one man whose weakness stripped the illusion of divine strength from the crown. Empires do not die in a single moment, they dissolve like fading light. After Charles II, Spain continued to exist, but its soul changed. The world that had once bowed to its banner began to outgrow its shadow. The story repeated elsewhere, in France, in Britain, in Russia. Each kingdom eventually faced its own mirror, its own Charles, the point where power collapses not under rebellion, but under the weight of its own myth. When scientists today teach the concept of inbreeding depression, they sometimes show a family tree of the Habsburgs. The diagram spirals inward until it becomes almost a circle. And in that circle lies not just a royal mistake, but a universal warning that systems closed upon themselves, political, social, even ideological, will always rot from within. Charles II was the man through whom that law revealed itself. He did not rule nature, nature ruled him. Walk through El Escorial today and you can feel the chill of time pressed into the stones. The marble corridors echo faintly under the footsteps of visitors, each one a reminder that memory never truly dies, it only changes form. In one corner, a tour guide speaks softly in Spanish. Here lies Carlos II, the last Habsburg king of Spain. There are no crowds, no ceremonies, just quiet reverence. The flowers left by travelers are simple, not royal. A single candle flickers beside his plaque, its smoke curling upward toward the vaulted ceiling like a whispered prayer. Perhaps that is the truest form of remembrance, not grandeur, but empathy. To see in Charles not a monster, not a failure, but a man born into the machinery of power and crushed by it. His story does not need embellishment. It stands on its own, a tragedy not of ambition, but of inheritance. Every era has its own version of the Habsburg mistake. In the 17th century, it was genetic isolation. In the 21st, it is ideological isolation, nations, movements, and minds that refuse to mix, afraid that difference will dilute them. Charles's body reminds us that stagnation disguised as purity leads only to decay. Whether in politics, science, or society, diversity is not chaos, it is survival. If the Habsburgs had understood that truth, perhaps Charles would have lived longer, perhaps Spain's empire would have endured with grace instead of guilt. But then, we might never have learned the lesson written in his suffering, that evolution demands humility. The world does not belong to the pure. It belongs to those who adapt. In the closing years of his life, Charles often prayed aloud at night, his voice faint but steady. If my suffering brings peace to Spain, let it not be in vain. He could not have known that, in a sense, it did. His death forced Spain, and Europe, to reckon with the consequences of its pride. His broken body became the end of one story and the beginning of another, the slow birth of a modern world that valued reason over ritual, life over lineage. And so, his echo continues. It lives in the halls of museums where his portraits hang. It whispers through textbooks that teach both genetics and history. It lingers in the lessons of every system that learns, painfully, to open itself to change. Charles II of Spain may have been the most inbred king in history, but in his weakness, he revealed the strength of nature's design, that balance is born from diversity, and that no empire, no ideology, no crown can outlast the law of life itself. Outside El Escorial, the evening sun sinks behind the mountains, bathing the monastery's stone towers in gold. The air smells of pine and rain. Bells ring again, softer this time, not in mourning, but remembrance. Somewhere, far away, a child learns about Charles II for the first time. Not as a monster, not as a ghost, but as a man who paid for the arrogance of others, and in doing so, gave the world a truth it could never again ignore. His echo is no longer sorrow. It is understanding. And through that understanding, his story, and his suffering, find peace at last.